we're happy young men. And then we say goodbye to our friends and family. And then we go to war. And then we become comrades in war. And then we are disillusioned by war because war is brutal and ugly and brutal again. And then we question what it was all for. The end. I read a bunch of World War I books in 2025, 5 nonfiction and 7 fiction, and I love this stuff and I want to talk about it. My name is Jennifer, and if you haven't been here before, the deal with me is that I came by my World War I obsession honestly. I came to it through studying the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I have a background in Eastern European studies with a focus on Czech literature and history. I also used to work in international publishing, and I'm interested in the truly international scope of World War I books. Most people who like my channel aren't going to watch every video of mine, and I get that. So I want this video to be a sort of one-stop shop for those of you who are interested in the topic, and then I can direct you to a few other places. I'll be giving you a general overview of every title and spending some extra time on those I haven't discussed before, and then linking to exact timestamps of any previous discussions I've filmed on the other books, because I do have some pretty deep dives on some of these. Here's the order of business for today. We'll start with the Hungarian portion of the video, a memoir and a novel, then move on to 3 history titles, an American collection of novellas, a French Senegalese novel, and end with the British portion, a memoir and 4 novels. And then to wrap things up, I'm going to share my top 10 World War I titles I want to read this year. So let's do this. First up is a memoir called The Burning of the World, a memoir of 1914 by Béla Zombory-Moldovan. And this is translated from Hungarian by his grandson, Peter. And an interesting detail about this is that it wasn't translated from an original Hungarian language publication. It was translated directly from the grandfather's papers. So when it was published in 2014 by NYRB for the centennial, it appeared in English for the first time. I'll give you the basic outline first, and then we'll get into the important underlying element here. So Zombory-Moldovan probably wrote these recollections in the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, so toward the end of his life. And he starts his account with the day he learned that Austria-Hungary had declared war. He was about 30 years old. He was on vacation in Croatia, and he learned that he was being conscripted because he went to a bathing station and saw that there was a notice posted. He was dazed by this news because he was an intellectual, a visual artist. He wasn't exactly spending his days in the mud and the rain prior to going to war. So he continues on to describe his experience in the early and disastrous Battle of Galicia on the Eastern Front. And then he talks about his return to Budapest after he was wounded. Now, the underlying element I mentioned is that the subtitle of this book shouldn't really be a memoir of 1914, in my opinion. It should be a memoir of how 1914 was collectively remembered well after the war. This is a feature of memoirs in general. How much are you ever really writing about what you experienced in the past versus writing primarily from your present vantage point? How much are your retroactive interpretations of things impacting what you can even remember thinking and feeling in the past, right? But when we're talking about the year 1914, this foundational tension in the form is ratcheted up because the sense of a before and an after in people's personal histories and in history writ large is so strong when it comes to the Great War. But in this case and in many others, people aren't even necessarily writing about the year 1914. They're writing about their own sense of nostalgia and loss in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. Zombory-Moldovan was reflecting on 1914 after he'd already lived through the upheaval of the 20s and 30s, the Second World War, and the communist takeover in Hungary, after which point he was deemed an enemy of the state, he lost his job, and he removed himself from public life. So, you know, whenever he looked back on this photograph that was taken of him 3 days before Austria-Hungary's declaration of war, even though he survived what was to come, he probably saw multiple lost futures. But there are so many tells in here that you should be skeptical of his framing. And I'm not saying he didn't have an inkling early on that Austria-Hungary might lose this war or that major change was in the air, but it's the degree and consistency of the foreboding that's implausible. His near certainty is implausible. If you were to take it from him, you would think he was some kind of oracle among clueless people, which I guess is how it would feel if you were to imbue your past self with the wisdom of your present self and didn't do anyone else the same courtesy. And I think overall that gives this book a really interesting friction and makes it such a stark case of certain general tendencies in autobiographical World War I writing. I'll also say a point of friction for me was that he didn't seem to gain much wisdom in the intervening years on certain things, on things like class and anti-Semitism, because the snobbishness and stereotypes are textbook for the Hungarian ruling classes of the time. This was a severely stratified society, more so even than many of the neighboring societies. And I tend to notice this kind of thing in Hungarian writing because, for all its flaws, the turn-of-the-century culture of the Czech lands was very different in this respect. The interaction of classes was more dynamic, and the upper class was much less structurally dominant. To be fair, this issue of mine could be seen as conflicting with my other observations, because maybe he didn't reflect on these elements of the pre-war world because he genuinely didn't reflect on them at that time in his young life, right? But I think that considering the context as a whole, that virtually none of this is pristine thought matter taken directly from 1914 anyway, it's very noticeable that in a doubly post-war and post-Holocaust world, he chooses not to reflect on anti-Semitism or class disparities or anything that was less than nostalgia-worthy about the pre-war era. And it is something that his grandson Peter notes in the introduction. I think he's a little soft on his grandfather, but he conveys that point nonetheless. So I would say if you're interested in World War I and memory studies, even though this isn't marketed that way, I think it could be a good one for you because it's basically like you're reading two books in one. The Hungarian novel is called The Rebels by Sándor Márai, published in 1930 and translated from Hungarian by George Szirtes. I discussed this one already in my mid-year favorites video, so I'll link that below. It's a World War I novel in an oblique way because, for one thing, it takes place in a Hungarian city called Kassa, that would become Košice after the war. It was in the portion of Hungary that was given to Czechoslovakia in the post-war Treaty of Trianon in 1920. And in the present day, it's the second largest city in Slovakia after the capital Bratislava. So here in 1930, 10 years after the Treaty of Trianon, a young Sándor Márai sets his book in the spring of 1918 in a Hungarian city that would only be Hungarian for 2 more years. Actually, only for a few more months, but in internationally recognized terms, 2 years. The novel follows 4 boys who are nearly men, they're graduating soon, and they know the war awaits them, but Kassa isn't on the front lines, and the people of the city, these boys included, don't really want to think about it that much. The military news isn't good, the soldiers who have come back from the front aren't in good shape, but maybe if they don't confront those parts of life, life as a whole can continue in a way that at least resembles a continuation. So in their quest to stay in the world of adolescence, the 4 friends come up with very elaborate and increasingly risky games. And to tie this in with the burning of the world, the book makes you think initially that class isn't influencing their friendships much, but it does come into play. For me, this is an obviously flawed book. It's an uneven book, definitely, and if you haven't read Márai, I always recommend starting with his later novel, Embers. But I don't know, The Rebels is a little offbeat, and it's one that captured my imagination. Moving on to the history titles, and I've discussed all 3 of these at length in other videos, especially this first one, The Guns of August by Barbara W. Tuchman. The most popular video on my channel is a double review of Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, which I read in December of 2024, and this book, which I read in January of 2025. Can I just say how much I love and respect all of you for that? The Guns of August is a Pulitzer Prize winning book from 1962 that focuses on the early military maneuvers of mostly Germany, France, and Britain in the first month of the Great War, August of 1914. And something I've mentioned before is that I'd always heard this categorized as a book about how World War I began, which is one of the biggest subgenres in the field. But this isn't actually about all the factors that led these countries to declare war. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand gets 1 line, and then we're off to the races, because what she actually wants to focus on is the initial military strategies, and then what did and didn't go to plan once these militaries were in action. The one thing I want to expand on here is that I hope my slight preference for The Sleepwalkers in that video didn't overshadow the fact that there are probably more readers I know who would enjoy The Guns of August. My dad is the only family member who watches my videos. Shout out to my dad. And after that joint review, he said to me, "So it seems like you're telling me if I'm gonna read one, I should read The Sleepwalkers." And I was like, no. the one you would enjoy and actually finish would be The Guns of August. I've recommended this to multiple friends who have loved it. My older brother wants to read it before he starts his medical school rotations. It's shorter than a lot of other history books. It's unabashedly dramatic. Tuchman famously had a wonderful turn of phrase. And it's not like this is a soap opera version of history either. It is carefully researched. The thing is, I read both these books less than a year after I'd finished my master's and had been back in the swing of academic writing, which, you know, gets a really bad rep, sometimes justified, sometimes not. The Sleepwalkers is for a general audience, I would say. It's a great read, but it's also intended for a separate audience that knows enough to question everything down to the very minor points. Tuchman wanted to write almost purely for a general audience, so she didn't have as strict of a filter on the claims she would allow herself to make. That meant there were times in my reading when she would say something that made me think, can you substantiate this? Or, I don't know about that one, Barb. On a personal level, I wish she cared more about Austria-Hungary. I think it's pretty clear that she doesn't, but there's just something irresistible about The Guns of August. It's a wild ride, and I do plan to read more from Tuchman because I'd be depriving myself not to. My favorite book of the year was Paris 1919, 6 Months That Changed the World by the historian Margaret MacMillan. It was published in 2001, and I'll link the director's cut of me talking about this in my mid-year favorites video, so just a few points here. This is about the Paris peace talks following the Great War, and I didn't think I'd be as interested in this kind of post-war diplomatic history as I am in the pre-war diplomatic and military history, because I share that major interest with a lot of people. There's just something about the origins of World War I that inspires more questions than answers, and also different credible answers to any one question. So when my uncle lent me this book, I was excited about it, but I didn't expect to become this involved in this part of the World War I story. Paris 1919 also made me want to read not just one, but several biographies of Woodrow Wilson, and I'm thinking, should I out-niche myself? Should I make a video comparing and contrasting biographies of Woodrow Wilson? I've joked before about making certain videos for a small audience, but if that one comes to pass, I'm telling you, it'll be for me and like 12 other people. So of course a serious part of me is like, let's go for it. Let's spend hundreds of hours on that. Finally, I know there are some of you who are here because you also have an interest in Eastern Europe, and although MacMillan's book covers a broad geography, the Eastern Europe sections are some of the juiciest. They're all about the campaigning from these pre-existing, emerging, and re-emerging states as to where their borders should be drawn. And over time, this campaigning made Wilson and the prime ministers of France and Britain think, why does every one of the region's leaders have the same bullshit story about some primordial claim to suspiciously huge areas of their neighbors' lands? Like, what's going on, gang? On that note, the big daddy of these nonfiction books, at least in terms of investment, is This History of Eastern Europe from John Connelly, From Peoples into Nations. Connelly is a historian, and I made a video all about my very bumpy progress with this throughout the fall of 2025, and I also discussed other elements of it in my Best Books of the Year video. This is about much more than the Great War. It covers nationalism across multiple centuries, but something that could make this a good supplement to other kinds of reading you might be doing is that each chapter can be read as a standalone. I mean, of course, there are through lines and Connelly's constructing larger arguments throughout, but if you like World War I, you can easily read that chapter on its own and get a lot out of those 35 pages without having to read 800 pages. You could borrow this from your library for 1 week instead of, I don't know, 13. The chapter I'm talking about here is called 1919, A New Europe and Its Old Problems, and I have a few observations here. First, even though the Treaty of Versailles only gets a brief mention, it's notable how Connelly's interpretations differ from MacMillan's. Connelly's take on things is a lot more middle of the road. It's more in line with the idea that this was a treaty written by victors to punish losers, especially the main loser, Germany, and that this focus on punishment then contributed to the rise of Hitler in subsequent years. MacMillan takes the view that despite certain lofty and unfulfilled ideals from people like Woodrow Wilson, on the whole, Germany wasn't treated any worse in the Treaty of Versailles than any loser in any previous war, and that actually it was treated better in certain cases, and that it took a kind of coordinated campaign to persuade the public that the Treaty of Versailles had been unreasonably harsh. So I like tracking these kinds of diverging interpretations, and on that note, my second observation is that when it comes to Austria-Hungary, Connelly's very measured in general. He suggests that certain political moments and constitutional reforms from the 19th century made the Austro-Hungarian Empire effectively unreformable in the 20th, and that those chickens would have come home to roost regardless of World War I. He doesn't buy that Austria-Hungary could have productively chugged along if it weren't for the Great War, but he also acknowledges that support for the empire among its own population was strong, even into the last period of the war, and that it was largely these external pressures and a rapidly changing world that precipitated its dissolution in this specific moment of crisis. So I would say he's not as down on the old creaky empire as Barbara Tuchman is, but he's more skeptical of it as a functioning 20th century body than Christopher Clark is. And lastly, Connelly notes that a lot more historical effort and time is typically spent on states like Germany and Russia in this late war and post-war period, but that the countries in between them had their own major transformations in this period too. They weren't as bloody and desperate and dramatic, but they were quite dramatic all the same because they were democratic revolutions. They were mass experiments in liberal democracy. The next book is 3 novellas, and actually the word novella is one this author disliked, but language evolves and it's the word I would most naturally use in this case. One of the nice things whenever you're focusing on a theme is that themes cross forms. I don't read a lot of novellas, especially not collected like this, but when we're talking about reading major World War I literature, you have to read Pale Horse, Pale Rider by Katherine and Porter. These novellas / short novels, as Porter would have called them, were written in the 1930s, and it's the third of them that's set during the last stages of the Great War and the early stages of the Great Influenza pandemic. And if you want to read on that nonfiction topic specifically, I can recommend the book Pale Rider by Laura Spinney, named after this book. Porter was known for a restrained style with this latent power to it. Something about her writing feels very composed and understated and natural, and I guess I use that last word because so many American short novel and short story writers were influenced by her style in the years afterwards. But also, if you clock in a little and pay some extra attention, it's like you can feel her taking the material of the sentences and expanding and contracting it in a very exact way. So the third novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, is about a young woman named Miranda who's in love with a young man named Adam. They've just met each other recently and they're falling for each other quickly. And that's one of the story's strengths, is these descriptions of that early hyper-awareness of another person. But they know from the start that this time in their lives is limited because Adam's getting ready to go overseas to fight in the war. And then she's struck with influenza. And the story has flashes of some of the elements that made this pandemic so unusual and so terrifying. It didn't come in the winter. In many parts of the world, it arrived in the summer and fall, and it killed young adults disproportionately. Of course, I won't spoil the plot, but the last paragraph goes like this: "No more war, no more plague, only the dazed silence that follows the ceasing of the heavy guns, noiseless houses with the shades drawn, empty streets, the dead, cold light of tomorrow. Now there would be time for everything." That last line is the famous one, but it's the phrase that comes before it, the dead, cold light of tomorrow, that I find so evocative of an exhausted world and of a generation drained of the hope of youth. I won't linger on this too much longer, but I want to mention that the middle story is unconnected to the other two, and it's rougher around the edges. It's a little less mannered, maybe less precise, and it's memorable in its own way. But the first novella features Miranda as a child, and that one was my favorite. It's called Old Mortality, and it's stunning. It's about the mythologies within families and how certain figures have stories told about them over and over. And then Miranda and her sister meet one of the figures from a major family myth on what becomes a day of great disillusionment. The next book is a French Senegalese novel, and it was one of my favorites of the year, so I'll link the exact timestamp of me discussing it in that video. But it's At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop, translated from French by Moschovakis. And some of you may have seen this more frequently a few years ago when it won the International Booker Prize in 2021. Man, it's almost enough to make you convince yourself that book prizes are designed to recommend you good books, and that's not just happening inadvertently. This follows a Senegalese soldier fighting for France whose world is transformed and deformed by the gruesome death of his closest friend. And because it's a book about trench warfare, it is gruesome throughout, but in unexpected ways in Diop's case. Since I'm going to talk about 4 other novels before the end of the video, I want to highlight how focused and even fixated this book is, how immediately immersed you are, and how it doesn't follow the linear patterns of a war story where we're happy young men, and then we say goodbye to our friends and family, and then we go to war, and then we become comrades in war, and then we are disillusioned by war because war is brutal and ugly and brutal again, and then we question what it was all for. The end. Diop's like, no thanks, I have a very specific story I want to tell, and I'm not faffing around. I'll let the rest of you hit those same beats. Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the world. Alright, we've arrived at the Rule Britannia portion of the video. The beginning of the end of Rule Britannia, really. And it would be wrong to start anywhere other than with Robert Graves and his memoir, Goodbye to All That, because this is a skeleton key for subsequent British World War I literature in general. And it's also maybe the work that Graves is most famous for now, that and I, Claudius, which I read way back before I had a channel. But this memoir continues to be a broader cultural touchstone. I think especially the version I read, which is the one he revised in 1957 and not the original from 1929. I talked about this book in a video about 10 memoirs, and I'm still mulling over the things I was mulling over a few months ago, especially how this is an example of pretty frank autobiographical writing that's not confessional. And in our contemporary understanding, those two concepts are almost fused. You can't be perceived as open and honest and raw and authentic and these other defining concepts of our era while also being emotionally distant, but Graves is both. And the feeling and framework and attitude of his memoir will be unfamiliar to a lot of us who are steeped in contemporary memoir writing because it's an example of someone who's narrating events and not narrating how those events made him feel. I called this a skeleton key though because Graves' experiences are emblematic of his generation of upper middle class soldiers who then went on to shape how World War I was narrativized. Any current English language author who's interested in writing about World War I isn't going to be taken seriously if they're not familiar with Goodbye to All That. And there are so many elements in here that have shaped other books, that are referenced in other books, or that are part of larger societal conversations that have continued to develop. So his portrayal of how miserable he was at an elite boarding school will make you more alert to how these boarding schools are portrayed in other books, both fiction and nonfiction. He also talks about gay relationships in these schools and his own attachment to a specific boy. Notice how he discusses these things. Then you have the really useful elements of first-person documentation of battles and of preparations for battle, of his significant lung wound. He contracts the Spanish flu in 1918. He runs in the same circles as a lot of people who would become influential poets and academics and political figures. And then toward the end, he goes on to describe his first marriage in a period when men were beginning to help a little more around the house and with childcare than their predecessors had. Although the fact that Graves was in an open marriage with a mistress as well was left out of the 1957 account. You'll have to go elsewhere for that one. So I recommend this memoir for its own sake, but especially if you want to read a variety of English language books on World War I. This will just contribute considerably to that project, and you'll see that as I talk about the 4 British World War I novels I read last year. The most recent book on the list is the novel In Memoriam by Alice Winn. It was published in 2023. It's a debut, and it's been so successful. I mean, a lot of my friends who have no special interest in World War I read this before I did, and I think it's a really good read. It starts in an elite boarding school in 1914 where the older boys are heading off to war, and the school paper records these in memoria as more and more of them are killed. And we focus on 2 boys in the final year of school, Sidney Elwood and Henry Gaunt, who feel very differently about the war and about the empire in general, and who are in love with each other, but can't be open about that before one of them enlists. What interests me about this is that Winn is clearly well-versed in World War I literature. She is one of us, for sure, but the sensibility she brings to her World War I novel is contemporary. The settings and details are accurate and of the time, but within a very 21st century storytelling framework. Part of what I think has made this so successful is that it can appeal to both people who primarily read adult literary fiction and people who primarily read YA. She's a very capable writer. Her sentences have this underlying energy to them. She's emotionally astute and tends to pull back in certain moments when other inexperienced writers might feel pressured to do a little too much. But her novel also has this quality I've felt with a fair amount of YA I've read where, I want to say what I mean here. What do I mean? The feelings of the main characters are always the main event in some way. Fundamentally, Winn wants to tell an intimate story of these 2 lovers and best friends. She's most interested in their emotional landscapes, how their love affects them and how the war affects their love, and then secondarily how they feel about their cohort of friends and classmates who are all caught up in this maelstrom together. So the cosmetic similarities with Goodbye to All That are striking because her characters are the boarding school boys turned soldiers that Graves and his schoolmates were in real life, and Gaunt's family background is similar to Graves, but I would say it's even more striking how different the book's emotional palettes are. In Memoriam is much easier to access as a 2020s reader, and it's probably a more practical entry point for a broader variety of readers. The thing is, and I just can't shake this feeling that I think Winn could have transplanted the archetypes of Gaunt and Elwood to other time periods and settings and ended up telling a similar story anyway, because it has the structure of a classic forbidden love story, and you're going on an emotional journey with them, and not so much a journey of any unusually insightful social or historical commentary. That kind of commentary is effective, but very standard. She's like hitting par on that and chipping in for an eagle with your emotional investment. I want to be clear, if this were my debut novel, I'd be profoundly proud of myself. I'd be like, I just did the thing. Thank you very much. But because I read all of the books in this video in the same year, I can't help the comparisons, and especially the comparisons with the last 3 books I'm going to discuss, which are Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy from the 1990s, because Barker has so much more to say about this specific time and place, and she also has that depth of characterization to offer. You kind of get it all with these novels, and the core story of this trilogy couldn't be transplanted out of World War I Britain. It couldn't exist independently of its entire context. One more example of what I mean here before I get into the trilogy, because having these books in conversation is so useful, and it's not about undermining Winn. Her writing is much better than plenty of other novelists. For me, it's really about celebrating what Barker can do. And I love that process of trying to figure out what it is exactly that's making any great book work. So let's talk about sex scenes. The sex in Memoriam is told with an individualistic lens mostly, and it's one that's very personal and vulnerable because the sex is meant to highlight that vulnerability of the early days of a deep love, when you could still come to regret giving yourself that sincerely with no guarantees. And Winn also places this intimacy in the context of a larger homophobic society where Gaunt and Elwood love in hiding, and where their boarding school culture tells them that this is supposed to be a phase that they grow out of, and ultimately they're going to be attracted to women, marry women. That's a significant background feature of the novel, but for the most part, these scenes are about what they say to each other, how they touch each other, and the connection that creates between the two in these stolen moments, which is no small thing, but Barker's sex scenes are attempting more and are accomplishing more as a result. Because especially with the gay sex scenes, they're not meant to be these private, quiet moments away from the madness of the rest of the world and away from the rest of the book. The book keeps chugging along, and the world comes into the bedroom. Class distinctions come into the bedroom. People's professions, their commitments and family lives. Multiple kinds of desire and power and expression are at play. Sex here feels like a continuation of life and not an interlude. And I think that's especially true in the second book. She's just conveying a lot without doing a lot of obvious work. All right, what are these 3 books even about? Lead with the sex and circle back around for the plot. Regeneration opens with an event that Robert Graves narrates in Goodbye to All That. It's the public letter his friend and fellow soldier poet Siegfried Sassoon wrote in 1917 denouncing the war, saying that it was being fought under false pretenses and that soldiers didn't even know what they were dying for anymore. And in Regeneration, the entry point here isn't Graves, of course, it's the letter itself, and Sassoon, who's been convinced by Graves to claim he was out of his right mind when he wrote it. So instead of being court-martialed, he's prescribed psychological treatment and sent to a war hospital. There's this early scene with Sassoon and Graves walking on the beach with their shadows looming behind them, and shadows serve multiple symbolic functions throughout the trilogy, but here early on you can see the shadows these men cast behind them in World War I literature. Through the eyes of Sassoon's doctor, Dr. William Rivers, you meet a lot of other patients, and it's not immediately clear which of those you'll be spending the most time with. And in each case, you're confronted with Rivers' directive, which is to care for and cure these men enough to send them back to the front. Of the 3, this is the book that feels closest to an ensemble cast, and that's a big reason it's my favorite, but that's also the reason other people prefer the second and third books, right? So I'll describe the general outlines of those here because I won't be giving spoilers, but I actually think I would have enjoyed the trilogy as a whole even more if I'd known how different each book would be from the other 2. You go from this broad story behind many doors in Regeneration to a much more claustrophobic story in the second book, The Eye in the Door, where you're opening fewer narratives, and the ones that you are privy to are even more intense. This novel homes in on one of the characters from Regeneration, Billy Pryor, who's what we would now describe as a bisexual character. And after he's been discharged from the hospital, but while the war is still going on in early 1918, he finds himself caught up in 2 different strands of government crackdowns. One is on homosexual activity and the other is on anti-war activity. Barker is using the limited, almost taut framework of this novel to enhance the feeling of what I was about to call paranoia, but it's justified. So I guess I would call it like a creeping anxiety, because certain political actors are trying to divert attention away from the increasingly controversial war efforts by identifying and hunting down the supposed enemies within. I won't get too in the weeds on this part, but the second book explores the impact of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I mentioned in my video on Victorian novels how Robert Louis Stevenson's book was a cultural phenomenon and became entwined with emerging understandings of things like mental breakdowns and what we'd now call dissociative episodes. So this is one way that Barker considers the interactions of her characters' pre-war and wartime traumas instead of isolating them. And that includes this curious fact about the real Dr. William Rivers, that he had a very limited visual memory in such a way that he himself came to believe he was suppressing his own ability to remember certain things. You may have noticed we still aren't at the front. Regeneration takes place in the hospital, The Eye in the Door takes place outside the hospital setting among civilians, and it's only the Ghost Road that takes us to the front itself, to the place where those who are deemed medically fit, psychologically fit, were always meant to return. Actually though, the fighting is a small part of this book, and I wish I'd known that going in, and I also wish I'd known that a large chunk of the novel is inspired by the journals of William Rivers from the time he was an anthropologist in the Solomon Islands. So throughout the book, Rivers is thinking back on this time and the way he approached death and suffering when he was viewing it through the lens of a separate culture and not his own. Again, without spoilers, toward the end of this novel in late 1918, there's a sort of peripheral death of a soldier in a hospital, and this scene is the culmination of the third book, definitely, and maybe of the trilogy as a whole. If you've lost loved ones, you know that there are good deaths, bad deaths, and even worse deaths, and it really matters which one someone gets. And you feel the truth of that so acutely in these passages in a way that gives you these bursts of insight into how much it matters, not just that so many of these young men died, but also exactly how badly they died and what so many of their final moments were like up until the moment of death. And so much about this portion is thematically echoed by the book's time period, the fall of 1918, in the last gasps of the war itself. The Ghost Road won the Booker Prize in 1995, and I would say it's my least favorite of the three, but I don't know if that would have been the case if I'd been familiar with the structure beforehand, like if I'd known that these anthropology sections were gonna keep returning, because the truth is there's already so much going on within this more intimate theater of World War I, and I did end up wanting a little more of that here because all three books are under 300 pages. These aren't epic, sprawling novels. She's really maximizing a discrete, controlled space. But knowing the arc of the entire trilogy now, it would be really satisfying to reread all three, and maybe especially this one, because they're individually excellent, and so is the story as a whole. You can definitely read Regeneration on its own, too, and if the thought of a trilogy is intimidating to you or makes you feel like it'll be a bigger time investment than what you can give right now, just read Regeneration as a standalone, you know? And then come back here to thank me for it. And now here are the top 10 World War I books on my current TBR list, my to-be-read list. At this moment, at least, these are some of my main priorities for 2026. So let's start with the three top fiction titles. The first one is the children's book by A.S. Byatt, which half the time I say the name The Children's Hour, which is a play by Lillian Hellman. But anyway, this is a story that spans the Victorian era through World War I about a children's author and the passions, betrayals, and secrets that tear apart the lives of her family and loved ones. And this goes from the cliff-lined shores of England to Paris, Munich, and the trenches of the Somme as the Edwardian period dissolves into World War I and Europe's golden era comes to an end. The next one is a book that I think only came out in English last year. It's called The Remembered Soldier by Agnete Danier, and it's translated from Dutch by David McKay. I've been seeing this in bookstores every time I go out, and I've heard from a few of you that you really liked it. It starts in Flanders in 1922. It's following a soldier after the Great War who's lost his memory and is living in a psychiatric asylum. And the last novel is crossing my T's and dotting my I's like I did with Pale Horse, Pale Rider and Goodbye to All That. It's the big classic, All Quiet on the Western Front by... Now, I just took one semester of German, so I'm probably going to pronounce this worse than if I'd never studied German at all. Erich Maria Remarque. No one can say I don't try. I'm not sure what the most popular translation from the German is, but I'm very much looking forward to this one and then to watching a few of the different adaptations of it. At one point I was going to do a TBR with 5 fiction and 5 nonfiction titles, and then I was like, why would I force that on myself when nonfiction is where it's at? So there are 7 nonfiction books on this top 10 TBR list, and 3 of them are ones I already own. So let's start with those. The first of those is In Flanders Fields, the 1917 campaign by Leon Wolff. This came out in 1958. It's a classic of the genre, and I found this copy in a used bookstore. It's the Folio Society edition. That's this naked hardback. And I believe that this exact edition of this book and I were meant to be together. The description says, in this account of the Flanders campaign, Leon Wolff graphically describes the whole terrible business from Haig's initial plan, his determination to carry it out despite constant opposition, through the early stages of the Great Offensive, and to the scene of battle itself, the Flanders fields which will forever haunt Western civilization. Couldn't have happened to a nicer civilization, am I right? This is under 300 pages, so there's a whole lot of compression going on. I'm interested to see how he does that. And of course, we have Vera Britton's Testament of Youth. This is the other big British World War I memoir, and it says, in 1915, Vera Britton abandoned her studies at Oxford to enlist as a nurse in the armed services. Before the war was over, she had served in London, Malta, and close to the Western Front in France, and she had lost all the men she loved. Out of that experience came this cauterizing book, at once a memoir and an elegy for the bright, passionate generation who came of age on the eve of war and vanished in its trenches. That is really good book jacket copy. I'm not used to it being that good, I'm sorry. This cauterizing book, that's lovely. Kudos to whoever wrote that. And then, as I promised myself, I have more Barbara W. Tuchman, The Proud Tower, A Portrait of the World Before the War 1890 to 1914. And I read certain sections of this in preparation for my video on the Sleepwalkers and the Guns of August, just to get a better sense of her World War I writing in general. And I think I'll enjoy this knowing that it's about Western Europe, so she can't mess up the things I care about most. Then we have one that's everything I could ever want. It's called The Great War and the Transformation of Habsburg Central Europe by Peter Judson and Tara Zara. Peter Judson is a star in the field of Central and Eastern European studies, nationality studies. Czech scholars love him. I checked him into a conference once and it was like I was talking to a celebrity. Not because of him, he was nice and normal. I was nice and somewhat normal. This book examines how the First World War transformed the multinational Austro-Hungarian monarchy into a fractured landscape of mistrust, scarcity, and dissolution, and laid the foundation for the new post-war world. Give it to me. And we have The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War 1914 to 1918 by Nick Lloyd. His book on the Western Front came out previously, and this one says the Eastern Front was a vast theater of war that brought about the collapse of 3 empires and produced almost endless suffering. As many as 16 million soldiers and 2 million civilians were killed or wounded in enormous battles that took place across as much as 100 kilometers. Unlike in the West, where stalemate ruled the day, the war in the East was fluid. I'll also just say a little bit of tea here. I requested this book when it came out in paperback in the fall of last year, and the publisher never responded to me, which I've worked that exact kind of publishing job where the inbox you're supposed to be monitoring has more things coming in than you could ever actually keep track of. So I do get it. And also, just because I work really hard on these videos doesn't mean I'm entitled to free stuff. I'm just saying I think it would have been a good business decision to send it to me, because then I would have been reviewing this book in this video instead of reading a slightly wooden summary of it to you. Also, who else is out there on this platform who's at the center of the Venn diagram of demonstrated prior interest in World War I, specific knowledge of Eastern Europe, and has visibly good hygiene? It's hard to find someone in these parts who fits 2 of those categories, let alone all 3. The last 2 books are both on the subject of memory studies and cultural criticism. So the first is The Great War and Modern Memory by Paul Fussell. I already had this on my radar, and then many people recommended it to me in my previous World War I video. This is a book of combined literary and historical criticism because he's looking at the output of a few major English writers, including Robert Graves and Siegfried Sassoon, and another poet who appears in the Regeneration trilogy. And then the last priority title is Death So Noble, Memory, Meaning, and the First World War by Jonathan F. Vance, which is about Canada's collective memory making in the wake of World War I. It's a cultural history of the 1920s and 30s, looking at art, music, and literature, talking about the symbolism of the soldier, the implications of war memory for Canadian nationalism, and the idea of a just war. Oh, that sounds so good. There's so much really good Canadian World War I literature. Thank you so much for watching. Further recommendations are always welcome below, and I will see you soon for another video.